Hi, everybody. So now we're going to the Q&A session with this, and the way we'll handle this is by asking you first to keep your mics muted so that no ambient sound comes in that's going to be different. We're going to use the chat box for your questions. If you have questions, please write them in the chat box, which I've just opened now, so it should be no problem getting those questions in. Depending on the number of questions, I'll occasionally combine a question on the same topic into one question so that gives people more of a chance or just get to the topics. This will allow Stephen to answer as many of your questions as possible. If we have time, we'll move to open mics at the end of the event. Let me just say, Stephen, that a lot of this is kind of shocking to a lot of people, right? I mean, when they listen to this carefully, they'll realize that the educational system we have today doesn't bear that much resemblance to what many people here have experienced when they were kids, right? That would be the pre-1970s kind of paradigm that a lot of
Yeah.
people grew up with, right? And the people who are younger, I mean, people who are 25 would probably recognize a lot of these terms, right? So I'll leave the chat box open, but I do have a question for you, a couple of questions I've prepared in terms of the way this is working. So I think a lot of people would admit that a lot of what's happening in the school system now is indoctrination along critical race theory lines, right? And we know this. So what would you suggest in terms of minimizing that propaganda or that indoctrination and trying to bring back what I think a lot of people would think of as the kind of dispassionate content, just teaching content that teachers should be doing, right? And not the DEI stuff. So how would you bring that back into the school system? Or what's a first step for that?
Well, I think the first thing is if you're a parent or a grandparent, I think that, we're going to have to take the responsibility to talk to our school children and tell them that this stuff is not true, that this stuff, there's no truth to this. This is someone came up with this, and we can put it in context that, the critical theory comes, first of all, from Marxist theory, which then when, it crossed the ocean and came to America's shores, was taken up by Black and feminist scholarship. And, suddenly it wasn't about, the workers and worker conditions, but rather was transferred, maybe it's the Black people or women or gays who are the ones who are oppressed. And therefore, we're going to look at everything. We're going to, everything civilizational is terrible and oppressive. Nothing ever gets better. We have to help our children understand that the classical liberal model, is not perfect, but it's always improving. And that, the inclusion of women, even as early as, for women to vote, or for equal rights, and if you're, inclined this way for same-sex marriage, is a perfection of the classical liberal model. To say, are there any reasons why we would exclude someone from these rights and responsibilities? Because the classical liberal model comes with both. So we have to think of both. So that's the number one thing, that you have to do a little bit of
I,
educating at home.
right.
But in terms of advocacy, you have to go to the top. You have to go to the provincial governments any way you can, whether it's the premier, whether it's the minister of education. Get together as large groups as possible and advocate for change. And the change you want to advocate for is a classical liberal curriculum and science-based instructional methods.
Right. Yeah. There's that Marxist element that everybody tends to deny but knows is there, right? I
It's
think that,
absolutely there. I mean, if anyone who is honest and has looked at the literature, how the academics got to, why is critical race theory in the classroom?
yeah, why?
Or, they call it culturally relevant pedagogy. Well, because they're in American schools where you had Black teachers in lower income Black classrooms, where, the kids were not doing well, where there was lots of behavioral problems. These teachers came up with the idea, well, you know what? We could like make the outcomes the same so that these kids get A's if we just make the curriculum about what they're interested in. So we can make it about rap, or we can make it about and the first person who actually gave a name to this actually talked about that. Like, let's make rap the official curriculum. Like, forget about the English language canon. Like, let's do rap. And if you've got a bad, a badly behaved boy in your class, well, let's make him the leader, and let's get him to lead the students, and they'll all do these things together. And then I'm not going to evaluate them. Let them do their own thing, whatever it is that they want to do, and then they have to mark themselves, and then everyone gets the same mark. Because remember, equity is not about equal access. It's about everyone coming out with the same outcome. And you can't do that. I mean, you could try
Yeah.
with Marxism. Communism certainly tried that, but we know it's just not human nature. Like, we do, not everything is socially constructed. We do come with our bodies and our biology,
Yeah.
and we come with different levels of talent, and behavior and personality and smarts and et cetera, that influence those things.
Yeah, a good summation, I think. So I've got some questions from the people who
Sure.
came in the chat box. So Richard says, education as ideological indoctrination is an attack on Western culture, history, knowledge. I agree with that, by the way. The family and so on. Arguably, we can say this is happening in parallel institutions, the ideological state apparatuses. And he mentioned someone called Althusser here, such as the church, the police, the civil service, and so on. How do we even begin to counter such a society-wide transformation? Before you answer that, I just heard the other day that in, I think, the Waterloo School District, they declared the family as a white form of white supremacy. That was
Yes.
astonishing. But anyway, back to Richard's original question: how do we even begin to counter such a society-wide transformation?
So I think that the Canadian way tends to be that we don't want to have conflict, and we don't want to make waves. So we'll be quiet, we'll just sort of nod our heads. No one wants to be called a racist or sexist or a homophobe or anti-trans or whatever. So we just keep quiet. We have to learn to be brave, and we have to learn to tolerate some amount of conflict. Now, by that I mean that we have to argue from liberal principles. We have to say, I'm very sorry, Canada is one of the best countries in the world. We are part of the civilized West. The West has no one wants to immigrate to the Central African Republic. They want to immigrate to Western countries. And the reason is because, first of all, classical liberalism doesn't care what you look like, doesn't care what your background culture is, doesn't care what your religion is, as long as publicly you speak the language of the nation, you are responsible to the nation, and you behave in a way that allows society to flourish. That's it, right? There's no other. Now, lots of other places are not like that. You have to share their religion, or you have to act in certain ways, or you're not allowed to speak your mind, or you're not allowed to work in certain areas, or research certain things. So we have to be willing to say, this is a silly, because it is silly, a silly attack on civilization. And let's be honest, right? If you get a cancer diagnosis, do you want the latest developments in Western medicine to treat you? Or do you want some folk medicine from some indigenous group wherever in the world, to do their rituals on you? Or would you like to live in a society where you didn't have a choice between the two, where you were, oh, well, today you're getting Dr. So and so, who's the best oncologist, but tomorrow, whoever shows up, you're getting this elder who's going to, smudge you and use herbs from that their grandmother told them about. And I'm not just talking about Canada's First Nations, and I don't mean to be facetious about their, the various cultures and traditions. Those cultures and traditions exist everywhere, even across Europe. The folk traditions, like wrapping yourself in mustard and putting a blanket around yourself to get rid of a fever. I mean, there is a classic Eastern European cultural tradition. But the thing is, they're all folk tales, right? They have nothing to do with science. They've never been proved. We have to say that the only way that we're going to have a healthy and resilient and developing society is to embrace classical liberalism, scientific principles, and otherwise to leave people alone to believe what they want to believe. And that includes for people that are religious, right? Let's not get in people's faces. We don't have to make everyone secular. I'm secular, but I have friends who are religious Roman Catholics or religious Jews or whatever. Let do we need to stick their face in something, or can we have a public education system that respects everybody?
Yeah, good answer, I think. And Mike has a question here. Do you think parents generally are aware of the radical shift that has taken place since they were in school? And that brings up the topic of SOGI, the LGBTQ plus 2A sort of thing that's been shoved in the kids' faces, and the current um, I don't know, conflict about sexual content in kids' books and libraries and so on and so forth. So do you think that they're aware of that? Um, or and do you think their awareness of this reality is critical to bringing about the needed changes to education overall?
Well, I think that, my general impression, I haven't done any research on this, but, just from being a human being and, you know, being a parent, having had a kid in the public system, is that most parents just care that their kids get their A's or A pluses so they can get the credentials so that then they can, get further credentials in university and hopefully have the same lifestyle that their parents have. So I would say that for the parents whose kids, they don't get calls from the school, their kids aren't struggling, the parents aren't noticing anything, they probably don't know. And they will say they don't care. They think their kid's getting a good education because the report card is full of A pluses.
Right.
I think that the people that are first going to notice are the parents whose kids are struggling because they're not learning, um, and that's a large percentage of kids, or kids that now express confusion because the way that they understand the world. And remember, developmentally, children are pretty concrete, especially young children. So for children to come home and be very confused about, I am this, I know that I'm this, but now my teacher's telling me I'm not, or that I could be whatever I want, or that people can just change their sex. That's the kind of thing where parents suddenly go, wait a second, what's going on? So I think that there has to be an education effort from groups that are concerned to let parents know, show them the results of, when people are doing this. Some of the materials that are being introduced by teachers in class. Remember, teachers have a lot of autonomy. They close the door, they can
That's
kind of
right.
do what they want.
That's
We've seen
right.
examples of BC teachers that their classroom looks like, a rainbow vomited in the classroom.
Yeah.
And they're worried about, trans stuff and everyone assuming an identity, and they don't seem to be interested in knowledge. And that's the
Yeah.
purpose of school. They've lost the script. So I think that there has to be education around that, and then I think parents have to say no, and say no both in terms of withdrawing their kids from those lessons, and also saying no in terms of saying to their kids, for example, you were a boy, you're a boy, you have a penis and testicles. You can't change that. That is all, that's what you've got. When the kid gets older, you might be able to say to them, look, people can have surgeries and take, hormones that will make them appear perhaps a little bit like the opposite sex. They come with a lot of complications, lifelong complications that you have to live with. They're irreversible. Um, if your teacher is telling you otherwise, then your teacher is an idiot. And there's nothing wrong with telling your kid that their teacher's an idiot.
Yeah. That's right.
When my son understood that many of his teachers in public school were idiots, and they weren't idiots because they were malicious or whatever, they went along with this, and somehow they left their thinking cap at home, because sometimes I would have conversations with them and they would say, I know, I wish I could just teach, Shakespeare but the school won't buy the books. Instead, they bought this book on gender identity, for example, if we're
Yeah.
talking about Soji, and this is what I have, that's all I have, whatever. So, but then the kid has to know this is not an education. Like go to school, hang out with your friends, whatever. The fact is, your marks don't really matter till grade 12 anyway. Schools won't fail you. So, be that parent, be that grandparent that introduces your kid to Annapolis, that, buys your kid, classic books to read and discuss them with them. Right now, that's the only thing you can do. Otherwise, your kids are not going to be educated.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned because it's leading into some of the questions that are coming up right now about alternate systems, right? And I know that in Eastern Europe, a lot of parents taught their children privately and just basically told them, "Oh, this is what the state's telling you, but this is what I'm telling you about Poland's history, or about our faith, or whatever." They had to do it underground, and
Yep.
and that was a long struggle for a very long time. And so I'm going to get to one of the questions that people have here, a great guy called Rick Higgins. But I just wanted to mention that Bruce Pardy, a Queen's University law professor, one of the leading figures in the Free Speech Union of Canada now, has advocated for something called the parallel polis. In other words, the separate city. In other words, separate systems of education in opposition to the broken institutions we have now. So is that the stage we're at? That's the question we want to ask ourselves, right? And then that dovetails in with what Rick has got to say here, which is, would you say that homeschooling is currently preferential on a purely educational basis to the provincial education system? So he says he has Christian friends who taught their children at home, and their children have gotten great jobs, are intelligent and articulate, right? But a lot of that is homeschooling. And so is that the future of education, or are separate systems the future of education as opposed to the public school system, which I worked in 28 years, and by the time I retired was virtually not, useless. But
So let me address Bruce Party first. Bruce and I have had some great conversations about, he's a real libertarian and operates on principles. I'm more of a pragmatist, and I'm always interested in sort of the unintended consequences of enacting one's principles. But Bruce would go as far as saying that the government shouldn't be paying for education at all, and we should just leave it to individuals, and individuals would do what they want. And even when I said to him, well, what about, the kid in social housing with a single parent who's working three jobs, put food on the table, he went, those are the kind of parents that will educate their kids at home, or, will find some way to get their kids an education. And he said, for the kids who are not motivated, who come from homes where the parents don't care whether they go to public school or whether they don't go to school at all, they're not getting an education anyway. So what does it matter?
yeah,
He's got, there's a point to that, and he gives a wry smile because he's sort of won the principled argument. But that's not kind of where I lie. I would say this. I think that one of the problems that Canada has is we lack competition, and we lack competition in almost all areas, which means that the prices for things are way too high. That our services are, basically provided by duopolies, and so it is with the public education system. Without any competition, then they rule, and the bureaucrats who are captured by this ideology, they make all the decisions. So I applaud. I don't know tons about it, but I applaud, for example, a province like Alberta that has a charter school system saying, we're going to allow people to open up their own charter schools and run the education the way that they want to,
yeah,
and and let there be a marketplace of ideas. Now, will every parent make the right decision? No, but that's true of parenting in general. So that's one option. I
yeah,
mean, the other option that ideally I would like to see, but how we get there, I don't know, unless you all have connections to your ministers of education and I can meet with them, would be, pardon me, for the public education system to adopt, a classical curriculum and science-based techniques for pedagogy. But how likely is that to happen in our current atmosphere? I don't think so. So let's get to homeschooling. I think it's a great idea. I think that's the only way your kids are going to get a classical education. The other option is I did some research into the private school sector in Ontario, and I specifically was looking at up the 1,200 private schools in Ontario. How many were doing something different than the Ontario curriculum? Very few.
Um,
So even the high-priced, elite academies, etc., they were doing exactly what Ontario's doing, just in fancier surroundings and for a lot of money. But you know which schools were doing things differently? The Christian academies, the odd Muslim school. There was one or two Muslim schools that also were following a classical curriculum, but it was mostly the Christian schools that were following a classical curriculum. All the other private schools were basically doing what public school does, and if you send your kids there, you're basically paying for the same education they get at public school.
okay.
So I would say, if you're Christian, you do have the option of Christian academies. If you're not, homeschool.
Okay. So we have a time factor here because we want to move to open mic and stuff, but I also have a couple of questions here. So if we could deal with them kind of briefly. On
Sure.
what basis, this is from Jesse Gronwald, on what basis would you say that classical liberalism will provide a good education? In other words, is the background assumption that there is a real truth and real good out there, and that humans freely studying and debating can get to them? It seems that part of the challenge is that families' parents are not necessarily convinced that this is the case. If not, what evidence can be used to turn towards such a worldview?
Great question. So, I think what drives classical liberalism, what has driven the development, not only in Western society, but remember that first of all, when we talk about Western society, it's a bit of a misnomer because we're really talking about the Eurasian continent.
Yeah,
Because throughout history, the exchange of ideas, all the way from China, all the way through Asia to the ends of Europe, the Mediterranean basin, North Africa, that's what we're talking about. So, but okay, for let's call it Western civilization. But for the criticalists out there that say, oh, Western civilization is white, nothing could be further from the truth. You've got a million different ethnic groups. But the point is that what drives it is the search for truth.
yeah,
So it's not that classical liberalism says we now know the absolute truth. It says we always need to be getting closer to the truth, that we, as these beings on earth with our five senses, have to constantly be using our tools of observation, our senses, and then our minds and our brains. And the knowledge that comes before us, the discoveries, the arguments, the controversies that come before us to better understand the world. And that if we keep doing that, we're going to get closer and closer to the truth. We may never get to the truth because
yeah,
of our limitations as human beings, but that has to be the drive. Progressivism and criticalism say there is no truth. Everyone has their own individual truth. Well, then you just have anarchy. How can you have a functional society or a society where people feel a responsibility toward that society and their fellow human being if everyone has their own truth and my truth is right and your truth is wrong and that's the end of it.
yeah. Very, very, very good points. Um, okay, so now we're going to move to an open mic format. If people want to ask questions, could you use the hand icon at the bottom or top of the screen? Because if people are waving and stuff, I might miss it. Please don't really actually wave your hand. We might miss it. But that's the way this technology works. So there's a couple of questions here that didn't get it to you, but I'll leave that for people and or I'll connect with them so that you can answer them.
Sure.
So I'm seeing no hand icons at the moment. Um,
Don't be shy, don't bite.
yeah, don't be shy. Don't be shy. Um, so maybe we'll, since I am not seeing any at the present time, I'll go to a couple of questions here
Sure.
from what we had before. Um, so Boudica says, have the student teacher practicum assessments been influenced by the critical paradigm?
Yes, absolutely. Not just the critical paradigm, but the progressive paradigm. If you're, let's say, I'll give you an example. At my institution, OAZ, there's one course out of all the courses taught by one lone professor about the cognitive science of learning, where they actually teach you, how people learn, and from that, what are the techniques that people must use in order to make people learn. If you did that in the classroom, you'd get a negative assessment because the first thing you would do is arrange the desks in a row. Then you take down all the decorations in the front of the classroom and move them to the back wall so that
Yeah,
students
that's what I used to do.
aren't distracted when the teacher is giving a lesson. And what is your assessment going to be? Oh, this is a sad place. We need to make this happy. It has to be like Disneyland.
It's
And the
chaos.
children should be in groups and facing each other and whatever.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So absolutely. Also, the idea that you're not going to stick kids in groups and ask them to discover their own knowledge or do their own learning.
Yeah,
That you know that if you're being frontal, the teacher's directive. Now, I should say, direct instruction is not just the teacher talking at you. Direct instruction can include spelling bees, math, baseball, coming up to the board,
yeah,
it can be, getting up out of your desk and doing things. But the point is the teacher is running it, it's whole class, and the feedback is immediate. So the children are disabused of their misunderstandings immediately. That's direct instruction. You do that in the classroom, and your assessment is going to be you're not doing enough discovery and inquiry-based learning because that's what creates critical thinking, which is actually a complete myth.
yeah. It's a complete myth. We do have someone who would like to ask you a question, Edward.
Sure.
Ken.
Hi, Stephen, thank you for such an overview. It's amazing. I'm wondering what criticalism in a math class, how that would express itself.
Sure. So before I give you an actual example, the Ontario almost put into its 2020 curriculum a thing about how math is a product of whiteness and ethnocentrism, and that we must commit to decolonize mathematics and make it, less important, so that we recognize other ways of knowing, including indigenous ways of knowing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how that would look, for example, and there actually have been people that have sort of seized on that and created things called like ethnomathematics or mathematics with an X at the end, where you're supposed to take children outside so that they can see patterns in nature and then realize that the whole world is composed of patterns. And somehow that's going to replace mathematics, as if you're going to build a bridge or a hospital based on the patterns that you see in petals. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with, looking at that, whether I'm not sure, maybe not in a math class, but maybe in a nature class, maybe just as an activity, outdoor activity, or maybe an art. But I just don't see how that is going to be mathematics. So in terms of criticalism, a lot of it is going to be, talking about how various indigenous people, and they're not just talking again about First Nations, depending on the teacher, they might be talking about, maybe some African tribe, or some tribe in South America that had some conception of multiple numbers or numbers up to 20. I mean, it may be interesting. And if you were, in high school and doing an anthropology class or cultural studies or something like that, it would be very interesting. But again, it's not mathematics. Like we want people that can build things and build your house so it doesn't fall down on you, or a bridge that's not going to collapse when you drive over it. They actually have to learn math. And math is not Eurocentric or European. It's global. It belongs to everybody. And many, many cultures historically have contributed to it, including China, India, and the Greeks and the Romans, and during the Muslim conquest, the North Africans, and then in modern times by mathematicians all over the world in every single continent. So it's ridiculous to say that this only belongs to Europe or only belongs to white people, but that's the kind of thing that they'll do. Now, progressives will do something else. What they'll say is, oh, we're going to give you a word problem, hopefully around, social justice things, and then go figure it out. Figure out, like, there's no one way to solve it. There's no one way to multiply or divide. Come up with your own way. Make a poster about it and whatever. So listen, it's okay, but you've got limited time, right? And you want to make sure that by the end of the school year, the kids all know their multiplication tables to 12. They can do it in their head, that they can do log division. If you leave this to them, well, then you're taking up time that is better spent uh, on actually learning stuff. And plus, except for the rare kid, most kids are going to tune out. They're going to be bored and they're not going to want to do these projects. So that's what it looks like in a math class.
Mike has the next question. So go ahead, Mike.
There we go. Stephen, just wanted to ask a question, something we talked about earlier about how do we how do we get from where we are to a better place? Like, how do we move education from what is really now propaganda and indoctrination in a particular worldview? How do we get it from there, even if it's like a starting point, or what do we do to kind of move ourselves away from this sort of death sentence that we've given ourselves?
Well, one thing that I would do, there's a wonderful organization that started in the UK, and now there's a Canadian chapter called Research Ed. So research and then ED. And they produce materials and videos and papers about cognitive science-based techniques for learning. Um, Speak to the teachers, speak to principals that you know, speak to anyone in education. Recommend to them that they go to the next Research Ed conference, that they go to the website, that they, start learning about better ways. If even if you have to convince them that the best way, because one of the wonderful things about cognitive science is it doesn't care if you're rich or poor, or it doesn't care, what kind of family structure you come from. These are structured so that we start with the assumption that the children know nothing. So we start from the very beginning, and we make sure that the children, go through a staged, slow climb through the curriculum as it gets more and more complicated. That's what this research is saying. This organization now is out there in Canada. They have podcasts, they have materials. I encourage you all to go and look at it. And, start there. Everyone that you know, speak to them. And then, in addition to that, what I was talking about, speak to other parents, talk about that to them. Think about, homeschooling units where, a collection of parents, can read up on this, can decide on a classical liberal curriculum. There's stuff out there. E.D. Hirsch, who is American, who talks about a core curriculum, which is really a classical liberal curriculum for the United States. I mean, you could adapt it for Canada. You add in Canadian materials, you take out some of the American history and substitute Canadian history. It can be done. But we have to start having these brave conversations and saying to people who want to, push this progressivism, this criticalism, no, no. And it's not because I'm a racist or, whatever you're going to call me. Those are just names or whatever. It's because I actually care about children and I care about education. And that requires that we front knowledge in front, not your revolutionary ideas or fads, but knowledge.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And Rick has a question next.
Great presentation, Stephen. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Think I've had a bath in intelligence. Would you, in your opinion, is education as we know it today, will it have a functional role in the AI world coming up, or it be something that's just arcane? That was then, this is now, and you just be getting an education for personal benefit, not for occupational?
Excellent question. So here's kind of where I lie on this. I think that AI, the function of AI is to take thinking out of your brain. It's going to basically make humans unnecessary. So if we look at it just in terms of, product, you want to have that paper done, you want to have that job done, you want to have that marketing done. Most of the white collar jobs are going to disappear to AI. So, looking at education as just, what you have to do, the credentials you get in order to get a job is the wrong way to look at education. We have to have a greater purpose as human beings, and therefore AI can't replace it and actually has no place in schools. Children should not need to do computers. Maybe in high school, when you start actually, writing essays and you're doing, online research. In elementary school, absolutely not, and no AI. And we can make sure that that doesn't happen by making sure that all the work at school takes place in school in front of a teacher without any electronics, phones, or computers. We need people to think, right? All AI is doing is sourcing past knowledge that is on the internet, right? It's not going to come up with new knowledge. So that's the purpose of human beings. If we just want to stop right here and say, okay, we've had a good run, but that's the end of humanity,
Yeah.
we're going to birth the next species, which is going to, escape the earth and live in the universe, then I guess we can rely on AI. But if we want to have a purpose greater than that, and we want to continue to think, then AI doesn't have any place in education.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thanks. Okay, we're